Welcome to McNally Robinson Booksellers. Thanks for joining us this evening. We do still have some seats up here at the front if you want to sneak up here while I'm talking. This is the boring part. We are thrilled to have with us this evening Joe Boyd, author of White Bicycles, Making Music in the 1960s. And if you're here tonight, you probably know who Joe Boyd is. He's created more rock stars than probably most of us will ever meet or see. And I'm sure he's heard this one a million times, but he was not only there in the 1960s, but he remembers it. So much the better for us. He's written about it beautifully in White Bicycles. He's going to read from the book a little. He's going to talk and answer some questions, and he'll be here afterwards to sign copies of the book. We have lots of copies behind you at the cash registers on the other side of the floor. So pick one up before you leave. It's part of the whole McNally Robinson bookstore event experience. So do silence your cell phones now before they embarrass you, and then get ready to welcome Joe Boyd.
Well, thank you to McNally Robinson for having me here. Thanks to Merrill Sagarek, who's booked me into all these wonderful bookstores. I get to go and see all these great places all around America. I have all good stuff, and it's very, very nice to see my book up there on the shelf next to all these great books. The 60s began in the summer of 1956. They ended in October of 1973 and peaked, P-E-A-K-E-D, just before dawn on the 1st of July, 1967, during a set by the group Tomorrow at the UFO Club in London. So that's obviously a totally objective statement of fact. So I better defend some of it. I'll defend the first part, where the 60s began. And to set the context a little bit in a compressed fashion in the first part of the first chapter, I explain that I grew up in Princeton, New Jersey, halfway between New York and Philadelphia. And my father was never very interested in television and resisted getting a television set. And finally, we bullied him into getting a television set when I was about 12 in 1954. And we got both New York channels and Philadelphia channels. And one day after school, my brother and I stumbled across this show called Bob Horn's WFIL TV Bandstand. And, well, I'll read a little bit about it. The world revealed every afternoon fascinated us. Just a little bit. Obviously, it was basically a show of Italian kids from North Philadelphia dancing to rhythm and blues records. And occasionally a visiting group, the Cadillacs or Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, would come and mime to their record and get interviewed. And that was pretty much it. Very low production values. The world revealed every afternoon fascinated us. I had a crush on a duck-tailed, hairdoed girl from South Philadelphia named Arlene, who wore sleeveless blouses and tight black skirts. During one roll call, Horn asked a boy named Vinny to explain the diagonal bandage across his cheek. In the deepest of Delaware Valley accents, in which the home city is Philly, and you dance on the floor, he said, "Well, Bob, I ran into a door." The next morning in my 7th grade classroom, we felt very worldly, speculating about the length and type of blade responsible for Vinny's wound. We were respectable middle-class kids. There were a few DA haircuts and raised collars in our class, but they weren't really serious, at least not Philly serious. Princeton kids would never perfect the dance steps and clothing styles paraded on Bandstand. The bourgeoisie can only borrow its culture from below and from above, and America never did have much of an above. The sullen insouciance of the Italian kids was intimidating enough, but we had no hope of matching the swagger of the vocal quintets as they walked on stage, or the shake of the head that freed their processed hair to tumble over their foreheads, or the snap of the fingers as they crossed their feet, preparatory to an elegant spin as they oohed and wahhed behind the lead singer. Horn designated the chart countdown and the interviews to a rota of regular girls, always blonde and always built. They were calm and professional while making announcements from the tacky podium, no waving to friends or giggling, and completely at home interviewing dangerous-looking pompadoured black men in sharkskin suits. It was not lost on us that these were probably the only occasions on American television in 1955 when white girls and black men could be seen in such close physical proximity. At the close of every program, the charisma-free Horn would thank the guests, the technicians, and his producer, Ernie Mamarella. We loved the name Mamarella. I would like to think that we caught its curvaceous resonance, but it probably just sounded funny to us. One afternoon, early in the summer of 1956, we were stunned to see a small, unremarkable man standing in Horn's place. He followed all the show's rituals without once mentioning the host's name. At 4:30, he simply said, "This is Ernie Mamarella saying so long until tomorrow." Speculation began on the school bus the next morning and continued between classes. After lunch, a group of us were talking in the hallway when Pat Fisher, a clever black girl with reddish pigtails, overheard our conversation. "If you want to know what happened to Bob Horn, you better get yourself a copy of the Philadelphia Inquirer," she said, and disappeared into science class. After school, one of us went to the newsstand while the rest grabbed a booth at the local luncheonette. We examined each page until we came to the headline, reading, "Disc Jockey on Morals Charge." The position atop the podium, it seemed, could be earned by visits to a motel with Bob. Horn was accused of statutory rape and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. 16 years later, I was living in Los Angeles and running the music department of Warner Brothers Films. Ted Ashley, the company president, asked me to take a lunch meeting with some famous TV producers who were pitching a series of music documentaries. When I heard their names, I could barely contain my eagerness. In an Italian restaurant on Sunset Boulevard, I asked Ernie Mamarella about that day. News of Horn's arrest had arrived late in the morning, he said, leaving him no option but to fill in. Afterwards, the station bosses announced that they were pulling the show. He pleaded and cajoled, pointing to the minuscule budget and remarkable ratings. They agreed to give him until noon the following day to find the most clean-cut, above suspicion, white-bread, all-American disc jockey in God's creation. Mamarella told me he drove all over Greater Philadelphia that night, interviewing one leering, seedy, unshaven DJ after another. He was on the point of giving up when someone suggested a late-night jock in Reading, an hour northwest of the city. He arrived about 2 a.m. as Dick Clark, the other half of my 1972 lunch date, was spinning records for local insomniacs. For Americans, the denouement of this story lies at the heart of our popular culture. Clark, his white shirt collar outside his blazer, his smile as bright as a toothpaste commercial, started work the next day. Within months, the ABC network was pumping the show into every market in America. Arlene, Vinnie, and their friends became teen icons. For the next 3 decades, American Bandstand beamed an ever blander version of popular music into millions of homes, making hits, creating stars, and homogenizing the dance steps and fashions of American youth. In a used bookstore in Albuquerque, New Mexico, many years after my encounter with Clark and Mamarella, I stumbled across a fevered but well-sourced history of the events of the summer of 1956, written by Stanley Blitz, a fan of Horn's. Clark, he claimed, had been waiting in the wings at WFIL radio, not out in Reading. And the rape and drunk driving charges that cost Horn his job were a frame-up. WFIL-TV was part of the media empire of Walter Annenberg, later Nixon's ambassador to London. And Mrs. Annenberg evidently hated the kind of music that Horn played. The deeply religious station manager was also revolted by Horn and his hipster ways. By the time he was found not guilty of molesting the girl, Horn was a forgotten man in Philadelphia, although not by the many bandstand regulars who wrote to Blitz of how much they loved him and how the show had lost its soul with Clark. My brother and I were appalled by Dick Clark from his first day on air. In a year or two, the rock and roll era was over, replaced by chirpy corporate pop. Like most non-conforming kids, we began to look further afield for our music adventures. Now, one of the places that we started to look, and the primary place we started to look, was in old blues and jazz records. And I think, in a way, the book, I guess a theme, not that there's really a theme, but there's a sort of subtext, an arc of narrative that runs through the book, in which that moment where rock and roll was kind of started to be sanitized, and all the Alan Freeds and the Bob Horns and the Jockos and all the transgressive disc jockeys began to be silenced. I mean, the major labels were horrified by what was happening in the middle 50s because they didn't understand it and they couldn't control it. And all the hit records that were coming out of that world were on tiny independent labels run by, Ahmet Erdogan at Atlantic and George Goldner at Gone Records, Imperial Records, Specialty Records, Sun Records, and when they finally come up with a white guy that was making this kind of music, immediately RCA Victor bought his contract off Sun. But the rest of the labels, Columbia and those labels, still couldn't get their heads around this music and did the best that they could to kind of crush it and bring it into line. And people who were in a way disenfranchised by that started listening to, old blues records, to folk music, to jazz. And it was these people, in a way, that emerged in the middle 60s in the wake of Dylan going electric at Newport and the psychedelic revolution and all that. These guys, these kids were the ones who took over. And that's when American music changed and worldwide music changed in a way. That's sort of the part of the story that I tell in here. But it begins, in a way, when a friend of my brother's named Jeff Muldour, he met him by accident when he just moved to Princeton. And so the three of us started hanging out together and listening to stuff. When I returned to Princeton at the end of the 1960 summer holidays, prior to my first semester at Harvard, Warwick and Jeff were full of excitement. They had discovered a Philadelphia radio station with a late-night jazz and blues show hosted by Chris Albertson. We were not alone. The revelation on the previous week's broadcast was that Lonnie Johnson was alive and well and working as a cook in a Philadelphia hotel. That weekend, we played track after track from Johnson's long discography. Born in New Orleans at the turn of the century, he came up the Mississippi to St. Louis and began a career as a crooning blues singer. His music evolved from country blues in the 20s to urbane Chicago style in the 30s and slick ballads in the late 40s. He was a brilliant and versatile guitarist who recorded duets with white jazz star Eddie Lang and cut dazzling solos with Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington's orchestras. Listening to his seemingly numberless recordings, we tried to absorb the notion that he was just an hour and a half down US Highway 1, living in obscurity. A borrowed phone directory revealed Johnson, Lonnie, at a North Philadelphia address. We dialed the number. Is this Lonnie Johnson? The Lonnie Johnson who recorded Blue Ghost Blues in 1938? Yes. Would you come to Princeton and play a concert next week? Yes, I think we can manage $50. We looked at each other in amazement. We had booked Lonnie Johnson. We commandeered a neighbor's large living room and ordered our friends, who'd never heard of Lonnie Johnson, of course, to attend and bring $1 each for the kitty. When the day came, we borrowed Jeff's father's Rambler and headed for Philly. Outside a downtown hotel, a neatly dressed, gray-haired man stood by the curb with a guitar case and a small amplifier. Lonnie seemed as pleased to see us as we were to see him. He told of returning from a European tour in 1951 to find that his girlfriend had run off with his money, guitars, and record collection. Rock and roll was coming in, and he didn't have the energy to fight it. He hadn't played a gig in 8 years. When we reached rural Pennsylvania, Lonnie marveled at the fireflies in the summer twilight, the trees and green lawns. It had been years since he'd been out of the city. He answered our eager questions and laughed gently. When we ogled a girl walking beside the road, he added to our teenage lexicon of essential phrases by warning us to beware the fuzzy monster that causes all the trouble. When we got to Princeton, the room was full. No one had the faintest idea who he was, but as soon as he picked up his guitar, all were entranced. At first, Lonnie brushed off requests for blues and sang standards like I Cover the Waterfront and Red Sails in the Sunset. White people always think Negroes just play the blues. I can sing anything. There was a beautiful black girl sitting on the floor by his chair, and he started singing to her, flirting shyly. As the evening went on and everyone relaxed, the music grew more intense, and Lonnie began playing his old blues. Our friends and their parents edged closer to Lonnie's chair in the middle of the room. None of them had ever heard anything like it. We collected $100 for him, and he was so pleased he took the train home to save us the drive. The following year, he would start performing in coffee houses for the young white audiences he'd met for the first time that night in Princeton. He made a few LPs for Prestige Records, was reunited with Duke Ellington at a New York town hall concert, moved to Toronto where he had the support of some devoted fans, and died in 1970 having added yet another chapter to his remarkable 50-year career. Now, from there until the end of the 60s in 1973, there's a lot of different stuff in the book. I mean, you know, we've got Bob Dylan at Newport, where I was the production manager. We've got Arnold Lane, Pink Floyd, Syd Barrett. We've got Nick Drake. We've got the Incredible String Band, Fairport Convention, Sandy Denny. You know, all these things. And sometimes I do readings, and then people afterwards come and say, you didn't read anything about Nick Drake, or you didn't read anything about Syd Barrett, you know, or why didn't you read about, you know, this or that. So actually, I was going to sort of throw open a little question or a suggestion from somebody that's particularly interested in one thing, and then I can answer it or read or whatever from that, you know. So it's kind of like jukebox here, you know, just push a button and I'll, Yale.
Tell us the story that isn't in the book.
Whoa. Well, there's a story, actually, there is a story that I wish I'd put in the book that I only learned after I published the book. Last summer, as many of you may know, Syd Barrett passed away. And for those of you, I knew the Pink Floyd in their early days in London. I had this club called the UFO Club, where they were the sort of resident band in the early months of the club. And I also set up my production company in order to record Pink Floyd for Polydor Records. I set up this deal, I had it all ready to go, but just before the signature was on the contract, an agent got involved. And anyway, long story short, they went off to EMI Records. I produced the first single, But EMI insisted that they use an in-house studio producer, an in-house engineer, Abbey Road Studios, to make all their records from then on. So my professional association with Sid was brief, but very, I mean, I liked him a lot. He was a very, very talented, great guy, and it was very, very upsetting and sad when he seemed to kind of lose it and was unable to really carry on his role as the lead songwriter, singer for Pink Floyd. And last summer he died. And it was strange because there was so much of him around, partly because of the fuss about his death and all the people writing memoirs and writing, reminiscences, and they asked me to do things. But also because there's a play that's a big hit now in London called Rock and Roll by Tom Stoppard. It's gone from the Russian anarchists in the 1830s, that's the big hit in New York at the moment, the shores of Utopia, to writing about the Czech Revolution in the Prague Spring of 1968, and the way in which people in Prague were obsessed with Syd Barrett and the connection between the two. And Syd Barrett's a kind of character in the play. But three things happened around the time of his death that I wish I'd known about, and I would have put in the book sooner. One is, I spoke to Nick Mason, the drummer of Pink Floyd. He called me after, or we met, or after he read the book, and he told me something I'd never realized, that Sid and Roger, I believe, both Roger Waters and Syd Barrett, came from families where their mothers made use of the spare rooms in their house. They grew up in Cambridge, which is not just Cambridge University, a lot of colleges and universities and schools and everything. It's a big student town. And students always need lodging. And so they had spare rooms so they would rent to students. And the mothers learned early on, when Sid and Roger were, 11, 12 years old, that boys were a kind of problem, that they were smelly and they paid their rent late and they messed up a lot and they didn't wash the dishes after they'd used the cups and everything, and it was better to rent to girls. And so they, all during their teenage years, there were girl students renting rooms in their house, which meant, in those days before automatic tumble dryers, that there was a lot of lingerie out in the backyard, hanging from the clothesline on a regular basis. And there were moments during those years when, one of the girl students would say, wait a minute, I'm sure I had 6 knickers hanging out there, there's only 5 now. And there was an incident reported in the local press about a man being arrested for having, prowled in somebody's lingerie and stolen something. And anyway, so that Arnold Lane, which was their first hit, is actually really a personal sort of folk song about growing up in Cambridge surrounded by girls' underwear. And so it's not just a kind of something plucked from the imagination, it's actually taken from Sid's own life and experience. The other thing that I learned last summer was when Dave Gilmour was doing a series of concerts at the Albert Hall, and he'd started doing Arnold Lane as part of his show with Rick Wright, who was playing keyboards with him, singing the lead part. And one evening, one of the 3 evenings, David Bowie came down, and he sang Arnold Lane. And he just put everything he had into it. He sang it with incredible intensity and passion. That was the song he wanted to sing. That was what he wanted to do. And some reporter got a hold of him afterwards and said, "Why? Why are you so keen on singing Arnold Lane?" And he said that Arnold Lane changed his life. That before he heard that record on the radio, he'd never heard an Englishman sing like an Englishman. That most of the pop singers of the day affected either being black or being American or drawling or trying to sound in some way mid-Atlantic or just sort of getting away from the Englishness. That rock and roll was a kind of an American medium, so you had to sing it kind of like an American. And the way Syd Barrett sings Arnold Layne was just the way he talked. He just sang it like an Englishman from the southeast of England. And that was such a mind-blowing revelation to Bowie that he said that was what really sort of liberated him to start writing songs and singing them the way he eventually did, which was full of his natural accent and without trying to be American. And that's what, and he attributed that. And the other thing that happened, the last thing that happened was that I was going out to a reading at, boy, it was weird last summer. I did all these readings at pop festivals. They've got, they booked me for a reading in their literary tent. And I hadn't been to a pop festival for a very long time, and I was shocked. I was really shocked. They're incredibly neat now. They're very middle class. They're sort of, there's designer tents all parked very neatly, and there are assigned spaces, and there are families who come there for the weekend with their children. When I last went to a pop festival, it was like a reenactment of the Battle of the Somme. It was sort of, and this was, there were stalls handing out free copies of The Guardian and The Observer, and there was a sushi bar tent and stuff like that, I thought, what? This is weird. Anyway, I was driving out to one of these festivals, and on Radio 4 they had a little short documentary on Syd Barrett, and they had a clip of him being interviewed on a arts program on British television in the spring of 1967. And I realized from the content of the interview that it must have been in May, just before they played the Queen Elizabeth Hall Games for May, which was this concert they put on. And it's extraordinary because the guy is a completely stupid interviewer who keeps saying, but why is the music so loud? Why do you have to play so loud? And Barrett answers them like he's born to be a BBC Radio 4 commentator, so calm and sort of measured and intelligent and well-spoken. And he says, well, Mr. Keller, we found that our audiences, we play in a lot of places where there's a lot of noise, and they like to dance, and we have to turn the volume up in order to get over the noise so they can feel the rhythm and dance. Very intellectual analysis, and I realized that this was 1 month before, and I'll just see if I can find this passage here. This is a passage in the book about the aftermath of producing the single and watching them walk off and sign for EMI Records. I went to the launch party for the single and wistfully wished them well. Witchseason Productions would have to get along without the Floyd. Arnold Layne got into the top 20 despite a BBC ban for indecent lyrics. Norman Smith produced Piper at the Gates of Dawn, but John Wood, the engineer I worked with, and I were gratified that they had to come back to Sound Techniques, the studio where we'd done Arnold Layne, to get the Arnold Layne sound for the second single. One evening in May, I ran into Syd and his girlfriend in Cambridge Circus. It is strange to recall that early on a weekday evening there was almost no traffic in the heart of London. Syd was sprawled on the curb, his velvet trousers torn and dirty, his eyes crazed. Lindsay told me he'd been taking acid for a week. A few weeks later, Floyd fans were lined up 3 deep along Tottenham Court Road for their return to UFO. They'd agreed when they got too big for us, but they agreed to come back in June, no matter how big they were, and play one more night. And so there was a complete madhouse, crowds and crowds of people. There was no artist entrance, so one by one they squeezed between me and the crowd, heading for the tiny dressing room in the back. I had exchanged pleasantries with the first 3 when Syd emerged from the crush. His sparkling eyes had always been his most attractive feature, but that night they were vacant, as if someone had reached inside his head and turned off a switch. During their set, he hardly sang, standing motionless for long passages, arms by his sides, staring into space. Dave Gilmore was added to the group soon afterwards to cover for him, and by the end of the year, Sid was gone. I remember the UFO crowd sitting on the wooden dance floor in front of the stage, completely engrossed as the Floyd played those early gigs. Pete Townsend came down one evening and spent the whole night at the right-hand corner of the stage by Roger's amp, tripping on something. When I came by, he pointed at Roger's open mouth and told me it was going to swallow him. There were many pilgrimages to those shows. Hendrix, Christine Keeler, and Paul McCartney on the same night, but not together. German TV shooting UFO's only surviving film clip. Hearing the descending opening chords of Interstellar Overdrive takes me immediately back to those nights when the lights would pulse and bubble against the stage. The crowd would cheer the familiar melody. The four of them would stare intently at their instruments, and we would be off. The jaunty choruses of Sid's songs were like fertile planets in a void of spaced-out improvisation. Returning to the theme after a 10-minute excursion was both exhilarating and reassuring. Even today, with Sid's era a dim memory and Roger off sulking on his own, there is something about a Pink Floyd song no one else has ever been able to emulate. And that passage reminds me of another thing that I didn't put in the book, which I learned after the book was published. I read an interview with Peter Jenner, who was their early manager. I don't know if any of you know Interstellar Overdrive. It has this beginning. I can't even begin to carry it to him, but it's kind of go da 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 da, and then it's off into this. And it was a very popular and famous instrumental that they used to do in those days. And in an interview, he describes the genesis of that tune. Because I was working for Elektra in London. That was my big break in the music business, was being hired by Elektra to go to London to open their European office. And that was just at the time when Elektra was beginning to morph from being a pure folky label into being a hip label. They just signed Tim Buckley, Love, and The Doors. And I was trying, and before I got fired by Elektra because they didn't like the fact that I spent all my time trying to discover new bands instead of promoting Tom Paxton and Phil Oakes and Judy Collins. And but I was trying to get Elektra interested in Pink Floyd, to sign Pink Floyd, but Jack Holzman wasn't interested. And and I was also making sure that the Pink Floyd knew about Elektra and this new development, so I gave them the new records by The Doors, Love, and Tim Buckley, which were in these weird new packages where the print was right on the cardboard instead of being pasted on the way they used to be. And one of those records was the first Love record, and the first track of the Love record was their version of My Little Red Book by, Burt Bacharach. Yes, thank you. And it's a great version, Arthur Lee's version of a Burt Bacharach song. And if you think about it, I always thought of Love and Arthur Lee as being this sort of California psychedelia. And I saw Arthur Lee a few years ago, but just before he died, doing a concert in London. And with a different backing band and this all very tight young guys playing all the arrangements very well and singing without the kind of atmospheric effects of the production, you realize that that's really where Arthur Lee was coming from, was Burt Bacharach and Gene 24 Hours from Tulsa, Pitney. Yeah, that was his context, not the 60s sort of psychedelia of Southern California. Anyway, Pete Jenner got the Love album, and he listened to it, and he loved it. And then he ran into Sid, and he started enthusing about this album. I've got to lend you this album. I wish I had it here. I'd give it to you, but I don't. There's this song that opens, and it goes like this. And he hummed the opening of My Little Red Book, which goes da-da-da-da-da-da. And Sid said, oh, that's a great riff, and just sat down at the guitar, and based on his manager's bad rendition of the Burt Bacharach song. And that's the genesis of Interstellar. That's how Sid wrote Interstellar Overdrive. Anyway, a question.
Well, Miles mentions Archer Lee, but he doesn't go back to Burt Bacharach in the Miles biography.
Right. So, another subject.
Oh, yeah. What made you decide to call your production company Witchseason?
Well, it's a little embarrassing, really. I needed a name. You know, it's kind of like, I was up against a deadline with White Bicycles. And I didn't have a title. And I had to come up with a title. And I'm pretty happy with it. But at first, the publisher thought it was pretty strange. And he kind of argued against it. But we had a deadline. It just went ahead because it was too late to change it. Witchseason, I needed a name because I had to form the company in time to sign the contract with the Pink Floyd that never got signed. And just that week, I'd always had a terribly low opinion of Donovan. And, he was a kind of pathetic British imitation of Dylan, And, but he'd come out with a really good record. That Sunshine Superman record, that first record that he did with Mickey Most, which was really great, well-produced, great record. And I was so amazed that Donovan made a great record. I played it all the time. And one of the songs on there had the lyrics, the rabbits running in the ditch, beatniks out to make it rich, must be the season of the witch. So I said, hey, I'm a beatnik. Or I was a sort of wannabe. I was too young really to be a beatnik, but I sort of aspired to beatnikhood. And I was out to make it rich. So I said, that's what I'll do. I'll call it Witchseason Productions after Donovan's Season of the Witch. So that's the answer to that. And White Bicycles. I'll read a little bit about that. The night of July 1st, June 30th to July 1st, 1967. I talk a little bit about how that spring of '67 was incredibly intense. It started out, we opened the UFO Club in December of '66, every Friday night. And at first, it was successful from the beginning, but at first it was just freaks. Just people who didn't realize that there were so many other people like them. And they all came down, they were so delighted to recognize people from different parts of London that were listening to the same kind of music and taking the same kind of drugs and wearing the same kind of clothes. And, it was a little small clique that all got together every Friday night. And then Pink Floyd had a hit, and the whole thing started to spin out of control, and there were weekend hippies coming down and people just taking it up as a fashion statement. And but also then coming down and, I had a security staff which sold the best acid in London. And so people would get a kind of intense experience coming down on Friday night, and suddenly, their lives would change a little bit. And the same thing happened to a lot of musicians, groups that were blues bands in the winter of '66, '67, suddenly started changing. Instead of, getting drunk, they started smoking dope and taking acid, and their music changed. And so suddenly, everything was changing that spring very fast. A month or two earlier, I never would have gone to this club, Blazes, and the group Tomorrow would barely have heard of UFO. Everything was accelerating that spring: new drugs, clothes, music, and clubs. The psychedelic underground and the pop scene were starting to overlap. UFO crowds were bigger each week, and it was getting hard to maintain the original atmosphere. It was also difficult to ignore the increased attention from the police. The longer the queues, the more customers were getting frisked and busted. Hoppy, who was my partner, John Hopkins, the editor of the International Times, the kind of Pied Piper of the underground, a wonderful, incredible guy. Hoppy ran UFO's Light Tower, playing records between shows, putting on Kurosawa samurai films at 3 a.m., and UFO used to open at 10:30 at night, and we closed it when the tube started running again the next morning at 6. While I stayed near the entrance and trousered the money. When plainclothes policemen asked to have a look around, I would state our policy: no search warrant, no entry. There was nothing to prevent them from merging with the crowds and paying their way in, of course. UFO's ads often touted a spot the fuzz competition. As for Mr. Gannon, our landlord at the Blarney Club, he felt the case of whiskey delivered to Goode Street Police Station every Christmas should take care of them well enough. A few weeks before tomorrow's return visit, on the 30th of June, a uniformed bobby turned up, asking to be allowed in to collect clothes left behind by a man being held in custody. This made sense. Half an hour earlier, a naked guy had bolted past me up the stairs and disappeared into the night. Hoppy and I agreed that an exception could be made. So I told the audience we were going to let the fuzz in to look for the clothes and turn on the overhead lights. Murmurs and booing from the crowd. As the crowd spread out in a wide circle, some garments could be seen scattered around the floor. The young bobby seemed to blush as he glanced at the crowd, a vivid cross-section of London freak, circa May 1967. Long hair on the boys, flower dresses on the girls, Arabian or Indian shirts, a few kaftans, jeans, even a few white shirts and khaki slacks. Many were tripping, most were laughing or grinning. The laughter grew as it became clear that the bobby's hastily gathered armful contained more than was required to make his prisoner decent. 2 or 3 pairs of underpants, gender undetermined, a couple of shirts, a bra, several socks, etc. As he made his way to the door, the working-class constable regarded us with amazement, not hatred. We, in turn, regretted that he could not grasp why we took drugs and danced in the lights, lived for the moment, and regarded our fellow man with benign tolerance, even love. That was the theory, anyway. Tested, it would come undone in the ensuing years, even as the bobby's mates donned kaftans, rolled joints, and joined the crowd at pop festivals. The first man I knew to take hallucinogens was Erich von Schmidt. You can see Eric's photo on one of the record jackets beside Sally Grossman on the cover of Bringing It All Back Home, and hear Dylan blurt, "I learned this song from Rick von Schmidt," on his eponymous first LP. You can also see Erich von Schmidt on the cover of my book. And Eric passed away just about 2 months ago. Mail order packages of peyote buds from Moore's Orchid Farm in Texas arrived periodically at the von Schmidt apartment near Harvard Square. He would cook them up in a pot and invite friends over to drink the soup. They would stack some LPs on the record player: Ali Akbar Khan, Lord Buckley, Chopin, the Swan Silvertones, Lightning Hopkins, then drink the potion and try not to be sick. If you couldn't keep it down, you weren't, in Eric's view, calm enough. Centered had not been used yet in this context to deserve the high. It was an experience meant for an intellectual and spiritual elite, not the masses, although Eric certainly would never have put it that way. The market is too efficient, of course, to limit transcendence to people who can stomach peyote. Down the street from Eric's flat in 1962 was the laboratory of Professor Timothy Leary, who advertised in the Harvard Crimson for volunteers to take LSD at $1 an hour, and was determined to become the Johnny Appleseed of hallucinogens. By 1967, pure, powerful LSD tabs were still available, while adulterated amphetamine-laced concoctions were starting to be widely distributed. Few bothered about how elevated the experience might be. In June that year, a News of the World reporter tipped off Scotland Yard about a drugs and sex orgy at Keith Richards' place and was rewarded with a ringside seat at the raid. It has become the stuff of legend. Mars bars, threesomes, Marian Faithfull naked under a fur rug, symbol of out-of-control decadence. The media stopped winking and grinning about swinging London and started wallowing in horror stories about teenagers being led astray. Sgt. Pepper was the world soundtrack that month, and powerful establishment figures were horrified by the implications of influential pop stars' open fondness for drugs. I can see we're getting a little. I'm going to compress this a little bit and say that the second night that this group Tomorrow played, and Tomorrow, by the way, had Steve Howe on guitar, who was later famous with Yes, and a guy called Twink on drums, who later started a group called the Pink Fairies, which is credited in England for being one of the seminal punk bands from the early 70s, early to mid 70s. And we were so outraged by what the News of the World was doing that Twink and I decided that we had to clear the club at 2 o'clock in the morning after their first set and march. Everybody in the club was sort of made into part of this demonstration. We marched through the West End of London chanting and protesting, and marched to the News of the World building and accused them of being all kinds of terrible things. And then we came back to the club, and at 5 o'clock in the morning, at dawn on July 1st, they played this amazing set where Twink ended up on with a microphone and a long cord, crawling through the audience, hugging people and murmuring, "Revolution, revolution." And they played their theme song, which is the song called My White Bicycle, and which was dedicated to the provost in Amsterdam, who provided free transport for the whole city by painting all these white bicycles white, and everybody could use them and then drop them wherever they were going, and somebody else could use them to go somewhere else. There were always supposed to be enough bicycles to go around. And anyway, the News of the World then got their revenge a month later by exposing us as a hippie vice den, and the police put pressure on the landlord. We had to move. That was pretty much the end of the club, although we had a few more months at the Roundhouse. And it's kind of a metaphor for the beginning of the decline of the ideals and the energy of the 60s. Without realizing it, we had started on a downhill slope that was mirrored in New York and San Francisco. The agape spirit of 67 evaporated in the heat of ugly drugs, violence, commercialism, and police pressure. In Amsterdam, people began stealing and repainting the white bicycles. So that's, slightly heavy-handed metaphor, ended up on the cover. Anyway, another subject, another artist.
Well, because of your career, the way it developed, you're very focused on London and the British scene, Fairport Convention and so on. I was wondering if you have any observations you can make about what was happening in the States at the time. Were there any American artists at the time that you either liked or loathed? Well,
there's a lot of observations I bang on quite lengthily in the book about the American scene. More in the middle. I mean, I think that I was still very involved in the American scene, coming back and forth a lot up until sort of 1966. And one of the things that was the most interesting to me, looking back, and also at the time, when I was hanging out in folk clubs in Harvard Square in the early 60s, I actually wrote an article. This is not hindsight. I wrote an article for Broadside magazine in which I pointed out the difference between the New York School of Folk Music and the Boston School of Folk Music, and how in New York, folk music was an outgrowth of left-wing politics. And I listened to records by the Weavers and Pete Seeger, and much as I love Pete Seeger, I think he was wonderful. He is wonderful. And I even liked some of the Weavers' records. But there was no escaping the fact, as far as I was concerned, that their style was to play a South African miners' song, followed by a Spanish Republican Civil War song, followed by an Appalachian ballad, followed by a sea shanty, followed by a blues, in a very similar style. The guitar strum was pretty similar, the harmonies are pretty similar, as if they were making the point that all men are brothers, and you can all sing along with all of their songs in this kind of strum. In Boston, musicians were obsessed with learning exactly how Doc Boggs played the banjo, or exactly how Booker White used his slide on his blues guitar. And people became specialists You know, they were really narrowly focused on one particular kind of music. And I felt that people in Boston were more interested in differences than similarities. And it was almost postmodern. I mean, there was two big icons of ethnography, in a way, in the early 60s. One was Alan Lomax. He would go all around the world recording folk singers as real folk, you know, in their front room, you know, or out in the fields working or whatever. And the other one was Harry Smith and his American folk music anthology, which is all commercial recordings from the 20s and 30s that he'd collected, and he just dubbed off and put on an LP in a kind of weird postmodern, context-free running order. And in Boston, I felt Harry Smith ruled. In New York, Alan Lomax ruled. And Dylan started out in New York, and he came and he, you know, wrote political songs, and he hung out with Dave Van Ronk and Pete Seeger, and that was very much the kind of route that he saw into this world. But then he started coming up to Boston. He started hanging out with Eric von Schmidt instead. And the drift, you know, it's a little of an this is a bit simplistic, I realize, but still. He began to appreciate the idea of music just for music's sake, and the sounds and the characters and the, you know, he stopped being so interested in music as a political expression. And in a way, that's what was happening at Newport. And I was invited, my first job out of college was to take Muddy Waters and Sister Rosetta Tharpe around Europe for George Wein. He hired me to do this job. And he evidently liked the job I did, so he said, well, if you're still in Europe in the autumn, you can work for me on the jazz tour. So I ended up going around Europe with Coleman Hawkins and Harry Sweets Edison and Miles Davis and Stan Getz and Max Roach and all these people. And then he seemed to be happy with the job I did there, and so he invited me back to America to work for him for a bit. And then there wasn't enough for me to do, but he said, look, if you're still here, if you can be in Newport in June, I'll hire you again. You can be production manager for the festivals this summer, the Jazz Festival and the Folk Festival. So I was the production manager at the Newport Folk Festival in 1965. And by the time I got there, that summer, you could just hear, you turned into the radio, in the car radios, you're driving around Newport, you could hear what was going to happen. You know, this was big. This was huge cultural tectonic plates shifting. The top 40 was playing I Got You Babe by Sonny and Cher, in which a number one record, the hook on the number one record, was Sonny imitating Bob Dylan. And then Mr. Tambourine Man, the Byrds, doing a Bob Dylan song in this completely new sound that nobody ever heard anything like it before. And then, like a Rolling Stone, here's Dylan with the drum kit and Al Cooper playing that amazing figure on the organ. And you're listening to this and going, whoa, you know, this is huge. You know, folk music was a little tiny thing off to one side, and now it's front and center in American culture. And so the anticipation that weekend was incredible. People didn't know. I mean, everybody, I don't know about everybody in the audience, but certainly backstage, all the musicians, all the people in the business, everybody that I knew was just gripped by the tension of what Dylan was going to do, because they felt if he actually went on stage, he'd never played like he played on the record on stage before. If he came with a band and went straight into the heart of folk music and played with an electric band, that was a gauntlet thrown down. And the tension was incredible. And Dylan surfaced on Saturday for the songwriting workshop in his familiar guise of troubadour with acoustic guitar. In years past, he would have worn a denim work shirt and jeans, but he and Al Cooper turned up in bizarre puff-sleeved polka dot dueling shirts, a momentary fashion fad from a Bleecker Street boutique. In hindsight, the shirts look ridiculous, but Dylan's endorsement made them mock-proof, and they served as advance notice of provocation. He played his allotted half hour and left to roars from a gigantic crowd in front of the tiny stage. This was the folk festival. No encores, the timetable had to be kept, and the Appalachian fiddlers had to start on time. The first skirmish in the Battle of Newport took place later that afternoon at the Blues Workshop. Alan Lomax was introducing a strong program of country blues, including Robert Pete Williams and Son House, to a crowd almost as large as the earlier one for Dylan. At the end, it was announced that there would be a performance by the Butterfield Blues Band. Even without an LP on the market, Paul Rothchild was still re-recording and remixing. People wanted to see what the fuss was about. Newport was becoming more and more a part of the world of show business, and that too upset many on the board. Newport was a folk foundation run by a board of directors, which included Pete Seeger, Alan Lomax, Theodore Bickel, the kind of old guard of the left wing of folk. The Weavers may have gone on Make Believe Ballroom in 1950 to plug Goodnight Irene, but Newport was supposed to be a world apart. Events were starting to spin out of their control. When Son House finished, I started resetting the stage. Lomax scowled as we lugged amplifiers onto the platform and ran wires from the extra mics to the soundboard. He told the audience that having heard real blues played on acoustic instruments, they would now hear some kids from Chicago try and play the blues with the help of all this equipment. As he walked off stage, he passed Albert Grossman, who was Dylan's manager, Butterfield's manager, etc., Peter, Paul, and Mary's manager. Grossman muttered, "That was a real chicken shit introduction, Alan." Lomax pushed Grossman out of the way. Suddenly, round one of the Culture Kampf began, with two large gray-haired men rolling around in the dust. Sam Lay, Butterfield's burly drummer, helped pull them apart. Word of the fight spread through the crowd and added to the charged atmosphere. The set was loud, but a triumph. Lomax called an emergency board meeting, which convened without Peter Yarrow, who supposedly couldn't be found. Peter Yarrow from Peter, Paul, and Mary, who was managed by Grossman, and voted to ban Grossman from the grounds. His crimes including not just the assault on Lomax, but being a source of drugs. And this was another aspect of the generational thing, was the old guard was freaked out by this, they're smelling marijuana all over the place, backstage and the dormitories and everything, and the fact that it was, anti-authoritarian in a way didn't matter to the left because it's not good revolution to be stoned, it's sort of, anyway. When the verdict was delivered to George Wein for implementation, because George and his organization that I worked for managed the festival for the board, that was the structure. He reconvened the board and explained the facts of life to them. If they banned Grossman, Dylan, Peter, Paul, and Mary, the Jim Kweskin Jug Band, Odetta, and Butterfield would leave with him. George was not sure the festival could survive the alienation of its biggest stars and the demands for ticket refunds. With heavy hearts, the board withdrew the order. Grossman was spared, but the old guard seethed. The following, I'd asked Paul Rothchild to come up and help me run the soundboard, and he and I sound checked everyone that went on stage. And the only time we could sound check Dylan was right before the evening concert on Sunday. Right after the Sunday afternoon concert, Dylan arrives. I joined Paul Rothchild at the control board as they started the sound check. Grossman sat with us as they played through the 3 numbers they had rehearsed: Maggie's Farm, Takes a Lot to Laugh, It Takes a Train to Cry, and Like a Rolling Stone. Nothing was said. We knew this was momentous. I handed Paul a fluorescent pink pen, which he used to mark the levels of each channel and the equalization dials above the faders. Other artist details were noted down on Paul's clipboard, but Dylan's were in ink you could read in the dark. Back on stage, I asked each of the musicians if they were happy with the positions and levels of their amps. There were no stage monitors in those days and no direct feed of electric instruments into the sound system. A microphone had to be placed in front of each amp to pick up the sound. I outlined the position of amps and microphones and the settings of the dials with the pink markers. The sound we rehearsed had to be there from the first note. When the stage was cleared and the gates opened to the public, none of us left in search of food. We were too charged up with adrenaline to be hungry. It turned into a beautiful, clear evening with delicate pastel light. As when the group before Dylan finished, we rushed on stage in the dark. I went from amp to amp, checking the pink marks. When the musicians were ready, I signaled with my flashlight. The introduction was made, the lights came up, and Maggie's farm blasted out into the night air. I ran straight out to the press enclosure. By today's standards, the volume wasn't particularly high, but in 1965, it was probably the loudest thing that anyone in the audience had ever heard. A buzz of shock and amazement ran through the crowd. When the song finished, there was a roar that contained many sounds. Certainly boos were included, but they weren't in a majority. There were shouts of delight and triumph and also of derision and outrage. Musicians didn't wait around to interpret it. They just plunged straight into the second song. Someone tapped me on the shoulder. "They're looking for you backstage." Alan Lomax, Pete Seeger, and Theo Bickel were standing by the stairs, furious. "You've got to turn the sound down. It's far too loud." I told them I couldn't control the sound levels from backstage, and there was no walkie-talkie system. "Where are the controls? How do you get there?" Bickel demanded. I told him to walk out to the parking lot, turn left, follow the fence up to the main entrance, come back down the center aisle, and he would see it there around Road G, a journey of almost a quarter of a mile. They looked daggers at me. "I know you can get there quicker than that," said Lomax. I admitted that I usually climbed the fence. For a brief moment, we all contemplated the notion of one of these dignified and, barring Seeger, portly men doing the same. Then Lomax snarled, "You go out there right now and you tell them the sound has got to be turned down. That's an order from the board." "Okay," I said, and ran to the pile of milk crates by the lighting trailer. In a few seconds, I was standing beside the soundboard. It was like being in the eye of a hurricane. All around us, people were standing up, waving their arms. Some were cheering, some booing, some arguing, some grinning like madmen. A Bloomfield guitar solo screamed through the night. Dylan's voice took up the last verse. "Now the winter time is coming. The windows are filled with frost." Grossman, Peter Yarrow, who was also on the board, I think I told you that, and Rothschild were sitting behind the board, grinning, the soundboard, that is, grinning like cats. I leaned over to convey the message from Lomax. "Tell Alan the board is adequately represented at the sound controls, and the board member here thinks the sound level is just right," said Yarrow. Then he looked up at me, smiled, and said, "And tell him," and he raised the middle finger of his left hand. Grossman and Rothschild laughed as I ran back to the fence. As I arrived at the foot of the stairway, Bickel and Lomax were watching Seeger's back as he strode off towards the parking lot. He couldn't stand to listen any longer. His wife, Toshi, was weeping and being comforted by George. I gave Lomax and Bickel the message from Yarrow, minus the finger. They cursed and turned away. I went back to the press enclosure to hear the last song. And everybody knows what happened then. He goes off stage. There's a lot of noise, which some people are saying are booing, but mostly I think we're saying more, which can sound like booing. Everybody does it together. Comes back on, and he, with his guitar, finally, after a long gap. He sang Mr. Tambourine Man brilliantly, reclaiming the song from the shiny but shallow Birds version and sending a signal to anyone who might be gratified by his return to acoustic moderation. There would be no blowing in the wind tonight. Dylan had left the didactic world of political song behind. He was singing now about his decadent, self-absorbed, brilliant internal life. He finished with "It's All Over Now, Baby Blue," spitting the lyrics out contemptuously in the direction of the old guard. After the intermission, fate and poor scheduling conspired to ensure that a sequence of tired, hackneyed representatives of the New York school was paraded before the exhausted audience. Oscar Brand, Ronnie Gilbert, Len Chandler, and finally Peter, Paul, and Mary. Even their fans seemed to understand that they were watching something whose time had passed. Almost done. Backstage, I saw you looking at your watch. Peripheral vision, you know. Backstage, the atmosphere was somber and silent, older performers in one area, younger ones in another. The significance of many watershed events is apparent only in retrospect. This was clear at the time. The old guard hung their heads in defeat, while the young, far from being triumphant, were chastened. They realized that in their victory lay the death of something wonderful. The rebels were like children who'd been looking for something to break, and realized, as they looked down at the pieces, what a beautiful thing it had been. The festival would never be the same, nor would popular music, and nor would youth culture. Anyone wishing to portray the history of the 60s as a journey from idealism to hedonism could place the hinge at around 9:30 on the night of 25th July, 1965. You can tell I like these kind of moments. That sort of, you know. The two camps could not even bear to discuss an alternative finale to "We Shall Overcome," so George had to come up with something. He played piano while an odd mixture of singers tackled "When the Saints Go Marching In." Backstage security had dissolved. On one side of the stage was a fat Providence disc jockey doing the jerk with Joan Baez. It looked horrible, a parody of the moving finales of previous years. I spotted Pete Seeger in unlikely conversation with Mel Lyman, the first real contact between the factions. Seeger asked me to ensure that the stage lights would be turned off at the end and one microphone left live on stage. The lights went down, work lights came on, and at the exits, and people started to file out. Mel came on and sat on the edge of the stage in the dark, pulled out a harmonica, and started to play Rock of Ages. It echoed out over the emptying arena without anyone being able to see where it was coming from. Mel was many things, not least a skillful manipulator of people. He had told the Queskin Jug Band that day that he was leaving them, reportedly to live in Woodstock as the Grossman Compound's marijuana curator. Soon he would start his sinister avatar cult at Fort Hill in Roxbury near Boston. But he was always a wonderful harmonica player, not a blues man like Butterfield, but an Appalachian mountain player, translating the high, lonesome sound of old-time vocal styles into the mouth harp. By the time he finished the first chorus of the old hymn, people backstage and in the audience had stopped wherever they were to listen. He kept playing, the melody becoming more moving with each repetition. People on both sides of the divide were crying quietly. After about 10 minutes, he brought it to a close, put the mic down on the edge of the stage, got up and walked off. No one clapped. People embraced, comforting one another, then slowly gathered their belongings and went off into the night. The old guard, I think, mostly went to bed. The rest of us gathered at a bar where Butterfield's rhythm section set up to play. As people began to dance, the somber atmosphere evaporated. The beer flowed, the party got wilder, the dancing more frenetic. And Sam and Jerome, the bass and drum player, never flagged as different singers and musicians came and went. When I left near dawn, it was still going strong. I drove back to my mansion maid's room, thinking sadly about Pete Seeger. I doubted he would ever come to sympathize with what had happened. There was no point wondering if it was for the best. All we could do was to ride its ramifications into the future. And that's about it. I think we'll... Thank you. You don't have the record, do you? No. There is a record that goes along with this, of a kind of compilation of things I produced in the 60s, which is an import. It's not been, this is also an import. We couldn't get any publishers in America to publish this book. So But that's available at record stores. I think Outside Music has it on up on West 4th Street, and Other Music. Sorry, Other Music, and Amazon has it. Well, sorry, forbidden word in here. Sorry, forget it. I washed my mouth out with soap. Anyway, and I'll see you at where we here. Okay, here.